6 months after my sister called me a glorified bandage changer in front of the whole family, she would find herself in a crowd, clapping until her hands hurt, right next to a soldier she had never met. Stay with me, because the how is the whole point. To understand exactly how we got there, I have to go back. My name is Elena. I am 30 years old. For the last 4 years, I have worked the night shift as an emergency room nurse in Killeen, Texas. If you know anything about Central Texas, you know Killeen sits right outside the gates of Fort Cavazos. It is an army town. The air always smells a little bit like dry earth and diesel exhaust, and half the people who walk through my hospital doors are carrying something much heavier than whatever physical injury brought them in. I know how to spot that heavy look, because I carry it too. Before I wore faded blue hospital scrubs, I wore camouflage. I spent 8 years in the United States Army as a 68 Whiskey. That is the military designation for a combat medic. When people hear the word medic, they usually picture someone with a white first aid kit jogging onto a football field. But downrange, you are a rifleman first. You carry the same heavy gear as the infantry squad you are assigned to keep alive. When the worst happens, you are the only thing standing between a bleeding 19-year-old and a folded flag. You learn to make impossible medical decisions in the dark, under fire, with dirt in your teeth. You learn that panic is a luxury you simply cannot afford. I brought that quiet discipline back home with me. In the emergency room, the younger nurses sometimes call me ice. Not because I am cold to my patients, because I do not panic when things go wrong. In the military, we have a saying, slow is smooth and smooth is fast. When you are trying to stop a hemorrhage, panic gets people killed. You focus on the immediate problem, block out the noise, and do the work. I do not wear veteran hats. I do not broadcast my service. Soldiers who do the real thing rarely feel the need to talk about it. Unfortunately, my older sister Sarah interpreted my silence as a failure to launch. Sarah is 5 years older than me. She operates like a bulldozer in a tailored blazer. She is a corporate director up in Austin, accustomed to directing traffic and dominating every room she walks into. To her, I was not a veteran who had survived the worst days of war. I was just the quiet younger sister who drifted through life, washed out of the military, and settled for a low-level hospital job. She loved having a designated family failure to stand next to. It made her own success look a little brighter. She loved telling our extended relatives that I was a floor worker who could not handle real responsibility. I never corrected her. I learned early on that arguing with Sarah was a losing game. Sometimes you fight for the truth. Sometimes you save your energy for the war that actually matters. I did not need her validation, but my silence came with a heavy cost when our father got sick. Dad was a retired high school teacher, 72 years old, with a heart condition that was slowly gaining ground. Since I lived closer to his house, I was the one stopping by every single morning. I checked his vitals, organized his pill box, and watched his fluid retention while we drank cheap coffee. It was quiet, unglamorous work, but I loved him, and my training made me uniquely equipped to handle it. Sarah hated it. She hated that I had a vital bond with him that she could not manage from her high-rise office an hour away. She needed to be the savior, and to be the savior, she needed me to be incompetent. Everything ruptured on a Sunday evening in late October. Dad had suffered a fainting spell that morning. It was a minor drop in blood pressure, but it was enough to rattle him. After I got him stabilized and cleared by his primary doctor, Sarah insisted on hosting an emergency family dinner at Dad's house. I arrived straight from a grueling 12-hour shift wearing my blue scrubs. I found my aunt, my Uncle Sarah, and her husband sitting around the old oak dining table. Dad was resting in his armchair in the next room. The air in the house felt incredibly heavy. Sarah sat at the head of the table. In front of her was a thick stack of stapled documents. I pulled out a chair and asked what was going on, holding my folder of Dad's daily health logs. Sarah did not look at me directly. She looked at our aunt and uncle playing to her audience. She said that Dad's condition was getting too complex. She said that he needed someone with real executive decision-making skills to manage his care from now on. I opened my folder. I calmly explained his fluid retention and how I was adjusting his diet to keep him out of the hospital. Sarah reached across the table and placed her hand flat over my notes. She actually looked at my scrubs, sighed, and delivered the line she had been practicing all afternoon. She said it was sweet that I helped out with the little things, but this was serious now. She said Dad needed a real professional, not a glorified bandage changer who could not hack anything bigger in life. Silence. My uncle stared at his coffee cup. My aunt shifted uncomfortably. They had all bought into Sarah's version of me. They believed I was too simple to handle a real crisis. I looked at the legal paper sitting in front of her. I saw the bold print at the top. It was an ironclad medical power of attorney. Sarah slid a pen across the table. She told me she had already taken Dad to a lawyer. She was officially taking over, and I was legally barred from making any health decisions on his behalf. I stared at the pen. I had treated blast injuries in the dark. I had held the line between life and death more times than she had ever balanced a spreadsheet. But in that dining room, I was completely cornered by my own blood. I walked out of the dining room that night without raising my voice. In combat medicine, the very first thing they teach you is that anger narrows your field of vision. When you are taking fire, you do not stand up and scream at the tree line. You get down, you assess your patient, and you wait for a tactical opening. Therefore, I kept quiet. But the very next morning, the freeze-out became absolute. Sarah moved with ruthless corporate efficiency. Using her new medical power of attorney, she transferred our father's care from his local doctor in Killeen to a high-end private concierge clinic up in Austin. I only found out when I drove over to check his morning vitals and found his daily pill organizer completely empty. I called the new clinic. A polite receptionist informed me that my name had been explicitly removed from the approved contact list. She was very sorry, but the sister's instructions were crystal clear. No medical records, test results, or appointment updates were to be shared with the daughter. I was officially locked out. Not because I was a danger to his health, because my competence was a threat to her ego. Sarah did not stop at the legal blockade. She needed to completely control the narrative. Over the next 3 weeks, she launched a quiet, steady campaign to convince the rest of our extended family that I had been dangerously inept. She told my aunt that I had been mixing up his blood pressure medicine. She told my uncle that my overnight hospital shifts made me too exhausted and unreliable to notice his declining health. She painted a very clear picture of a well-meaning but dim-witted failure who had almost caused a major medical crisis until she swooped in to save the day. It hurt. I will not lie to you and pretend it rolled right off my back. Betrayal from blood is a very specific kind of wound. It does not cut cleanly. It tears. But I leaned heavily into my training. You do not fight the weather. You prepare for it. If I could not be his formal caretaker anymore, I had to figure out how to be his shadow. I visited him on my days off. I sat in his living room, talked to him about baseball, and watched his skin tone carefully. I checked for swelling in his ankles when I helped him put on his shoes. I was gathering my own silent assessment, terrified that her expensive Austin doctor was going to miss something obvious because they were not seeing him every single day. During those weeks, I worked brutal overnight shifts in the emergency room. The hospital was a chaotic pressure cooker of winter flu cases and highway accidents. I was pulling 50, sometimes 60 hours a week. But at work, I was not the family disappointment. I was Elena. I was the nurse the young doctors looked for when a trauma code turned bad. I knew my worth. One Tuesday afternoon, about a month into the freeze-out, I stopped by his house. Dad was napping heavily in his recliner. He looked pale, and his breathing was shallow. I went into the kitchen to wash up the coffee cups he had left in the sink. Next to the telephone on the wall, his old answering machine was blinking with a solid red light. Dad still used a landline, and he was deeply attached to the little digital tape recorder that sat on the counter. Usually, it just held automated pharmacy reminders, but that day I noticed a yellow sticky note stuck to the machine. Dad had written down a phone number in his shaky handwriting, followed by the word cardiologist, but the last 2 digits were smudged and unreadable. I knew Sarah was supposed to schedule him for a critical stress test that week. I needed to know if she had actually secured the appointment. If Dad had missed a call from the specialist, I had to write down the correct number so he could call them back when he woke up. I pressed the play button to retrieve the last message. The machine beeped. A robotic voice announced that the message was 2 days old. I grabbed a pen and waited for the receptionist to speak. Instead, I heard my sister. It was not a message meant for Dad. Sarah must have dialed his landline by mistake while trying to reach her husband, let the machine pick up, and just started talking through the hands-free system in her car. I stood completely still in the kitchen, the pen hovering over the notepad. She was complaining bitterly about having to drive down to Colleen to manage his paperwork. Then her tone shifted. She let out a sharp, genuine sigh of frustration. I froze, realizing she had accidentally pocket-dialed the house, and she was talking directly to her husband about exactly why she had to ruin my reputation. "I know it is a massive hassle," she said, her voice sharp and tight over the road noise. "I know I am the one doing all the driving right now, but I have to keep Elena completely locked out of this." There was a brief pause. She was listening to her husband reply. Then she spoke again, and every word dropped like a stone onto the kitchen counter. "Look," she sighed, "I know she could handle the daily care. I know she is actually a highly competent medical professional. She understands Dad's heart condition perfectly well." I stopped breathing. The hum of the refrigerator seemed to vanish, but if I let her step up, she continued, her tone turning incredibly cold. "If I let the family see her actually keeping Dad stable, where does that leave me? I am the successful one. I am the director. I cannot have Aunt Linda whispering that my little sister, the floor nurse, is the hero holding the family together. I need her to be the failure. It is the only way I look like the savior. If I have to keep telling everyone she mixes up the pills, then that is what I will do. It works. They always believe it." The machine beeped twice. End of message. I stood in the center of the kitchen for a very long time, staring at the blinking red light. That was the hidden truth. It was not a misunderstanding. It was not a sister fiercely protecting her sick father out of a misguided sense of anxiety. It was conscious, deliberate sabotage. She was perfectly willing to compromise our father's daily care and completely destroy my reputation with our own blood relatives simply because my competence threatened her fragile ego. She knew my worth perfectly well. She just needed to bury it so she could cast a taller shadow. A younger, angrier version of me would have ripped that answering machine right off the wall. Most people would have grabbed their car keys, driven straight to her corporate office in Austin, and played that tape in front of her entire staff. But anger is a terrible tactical weapon. Anger narrows your field of vision and makes you sloppy. In the Army, a platoon sergeant once taught me a vital lesson. He said, "You never interrupt your enemy when they are operating on a false assumption. And you never strike until you hold overwhelming proof." I did not yell. I did not throw a coffee cup. I calmly pulled my cell phone from my pocket. I opened my voice memo application, held the microphone directly up to the answering machine speaker, and pressed the recording button. I played the message again, capturing a perfectly clear digital audio file of her entire confession. I emailed the audio file to myself, backed it up to a secure cloud server, and then quietly deleted the original message off Dad's machine. I had my proof. The hidden truth was sitting safely in my pocket. Now, I just had to wait for the right moment to deploy it. Life settled back into a tense routine. I continued my silent shadow visits at Dad's house, and I kept working brutal emergency room shifts at the hospital. Then, on a cold Thursday morning, the ground suddenly shifted. I was at the charting station finishing my notes after a messy 4-hour trauma code. My scrubs were stained, and my eyes were burning from exhaustion. The charge nurse walked up behind me. She gave me a very strange look and quietly mentioned that the Human Resources Department had been asking probing questions about my employment history all morning. My stomach completely dropped. Had Sarah decided to escalate her campaign? Had she called my workplace to file a fabricated complaint, trying to sabotage my job to prove to the family that I was unstable? Before I could ask the charge nurse any questions, the overhead intercom clicked on. My name echoed through the emergency room. It was a direct summons to the Chief Hospital Administrator's office on the executive floor. Immediately. Floor nurses do not get summoned to the executive floor at 7 a.m. unless their career is ending. I washed my hands, smoothed down my scrubs, and walked to the elevator. I touched the phone in my pocket, double-checking that the audio file was still there. I prepared myself to fight for my nursing license. I walked down the quiet, carpeted hallway and knocked on the heavy wooden door. I was told to come in. I opened the door, bracing myself to see a stern human resources director holding a disciplinary write-up. Instead, our chief hospital administrator was sitting behind his large mahogany desk. But he was not alone. Sitting in the leather guest chair was a stranger in his late 50s, wearing a sharp tweed jacket. He had a tight military haircut and a tiny enameled American flag pinned to his lapel. And resting directly in the center of the coffee table between them was a thick, heavy green folder with official military seals pressed into the corners. It looked exactly like a classified personnel file. The administrator stood up. He did not look angry at all. He looked slightly awed. He gestured to the guest and told me the man was a representative from a powerful local veterans group. The older man stood up, extended his hand, and stared directly into my eyes. He said they had spent the last 3 months cutting through government red tape, and they needed to have a serious conversation about what was inside that heavy green folder. He introduced himself as a regional director for a massive statewide veterans coalition. I sat down in the empty leather chair, completely stunned. The director explained that his coalition partnered with the city of Killeen and the local hospital network every single year. They searched for veterans who had transitioned into civilian service roles and quietly continued to anchor their communities. They were looking for their lead nominee for the Hometown Hero Award, a major civic honor presented on live television every Veterans Day. When the senior emergency room doctor submitted my name for my trauma work on the night shift, the coalition ran a standard military background check to confirm my discharge status. They hit a classified wall. The director opened the heavy green folder. He said it took them 3 months and a congressional liaison to finally unseal the full post-action reports from my last deployment downrange. He pulled out a crisp, official parchment document and slid it across the desk. It was not a civilian nursing certificate. It was a perfectly preserved copy of my combat medic badge authorization. Pinned directly beneath it on the paper was a citation for a Bronze Star Medal. It included a tiny, sharp metallic letter V. The letter V stands for Valor. It means the medal was not awarded for administrative excellence or end-of-tour good behavior. It means it was earned in direct combat against an armed enemy. The hospital administrator stared at me completely stunned. I had worked on his trauma floor for 4 years, and I had never once mentioned it. The director leaned forward, tapping the citation. He read the unredacted narrative out loud in the quiet office. He read about a chaotic ambush in a dusty river valley. He read about an armored convoy pinned down under heavy machine gun fire. He read about a young medic who refused to stay behind cover, sprinting into the open crossfire to drag 3 severely wounded infantrymen back to a burning transport truck. He read how that medic clamped a shattered femoral artery with her bare hands, refusing to retreat, and kept those men breathing for 40 agonizing minutes until the medical evacuation helicopters finally broke through the dust. The words hung in the air. The hum of the air conditioning suddenly felt very loud. The director looked at me. He said the coalition and the city council had unanimously voted. They did not just want to give me a civilian hospital award. They were officially nominating me for the main hometown hero honor, and they wanted a visiting Army general to read that exact combat citation on live local television. I stared at the thick stack of papers. My chest tightened. I did not want a massive public spectacle. The discipline that kept me steady in the emergency room demanded that I stay completely out of the spotlight. Soldiers who do the real thing rarely want to stand on a brightly lit stage and listen to civilians applaud the worst day of their lives. Plus, I knew exactly what a public broadcast like that would trigger. Sarah would see it. The extended family would see it. It would force a massive collision between the quiet reality of my life and the loud, insulting narrative my sister had built. I have a question for you. Tell me your answer in the comments below. If you had spent years trying to stay completely invisible, would you walk away from that table to protect your peace? Or would you step under the bright lights to accept a medal you never asked for? I chose peace. I shook my head. I thanked them respectfully for their time, but I politely declined the honor. I told them I was just doing my job downrange, and I preferred to remain invisible. I stood up to leave. The director did not argue. He simply reached into the green folder and pulled out a single sheet of lined yellow paper. He told me they had anticipated my refusal. He knew combat veterans hated cameras. But he said the hospital and the veterans group were not actually the ones demanding that I stand on that stage. He slid the yellow paper across the polished wood. He explained that when they unsealed the military file, standard protocol required them to notify the other surviving soldiers listed in the incident report to verify the narrative. The director pointed to the scrawled signature at the bottom of the yellow page. He told me the nomination was being relentlessly driven by a private citizen. One of the men I pulled out of the dirt that day had answered the email. I looked at the signature. It was a name I had not spoken in 8 years. It was the young, terrified 19-year-old infantryman whose artery I had held together in the dirt. I had always assumed he died on the flight out. The director spoke very softly. He told me the young soldier had survived. He had spent years learning how to walk again, and when he found out about the hometown hero ceremony in Killeen, he had personally written that letter and overnighted it to the coalition. The director folded his hands. He told me the young man had already requested leave from his civilian job. He had purchased a plane ticket, and he was currently scheduled to sit in the 3rd row of the Civic Auditorium on Veterans Day, specifically to watch his medic finally get pinned. I stared at the name scrawled in blue ink at the bottom of that lined yellow paper. In the Army, a medic belongs to her soldiers. You do not leave a casualty on the field, and you absolutely do not abandon a soldier who is flying halfway across the country just to stand in your corner. I could have walked away from the hospital administrator. I could have walked away from the Veterans Coalition. But I could not walk away from a ghost who had suddenly proved he was alive. I looked at the older director. I swallowed the lump in my throat, gave a single nod, and told him I would be there. The countdown to Veterans Day began. I kept the entire operation completely quiet. I worked my trauma shifts, checked my father's ankles during my shadow visits, and kept my head down. However, the machinery of a massive citywide event moves on its own schedule. 2 weeks before the ceremony, formal invitations embossed on heavy cardstock were mailed out by the mayor's office to the families of all the nominees. Since Sarah had legally seized all the mail forwarding and communication channels for our father, the thick envelope landed directly on her desk in Austin. She did exactly what I expected her to do. She assumed it was a patronizing minor hospital certificate. She saw the words "hometown hero" and thought the local clinic was just handing out participation trophies to the floor staff. Because her entire reality was built on the assumption that I was a failure, it never even occurred to her that I could be honored for anything significant. Instead of ignoring it, she saw a perfect opportunity to perform. She immediately secured 5 seats in the front row. She invited our aunt, our uncle, and her husband, and she even arranged for a specialized medical transport van to bring our father down for the afternoon. Sarah wanted to hold court. She wanted to sit in the front row wearing an expensive dress, completely surrounded by our extended family. She planned to smile, clap softly, and lean over to whisper how sweet it was that the hospital gave the little floor nurse a certificate to make her feel important. It was a flawless stage to reinforce her narrative that she was the successful executive humoring the family disappointment. I let her build her trap. Overconfident people always get careless. Veterans Day arrived on a cold, bright Tuesday afternoon. The Killeen Civic Auditorium is a massive modern structure built with glass and limestone. When I arrived, the scale of the event hit me like a physical blow. Massive spotlights illuminated the entrance. 2 heavy satellite trucks from the local news stations were parked near the curb, running thick black cables through the front doors. I walked into the grand lobby. It was packed with hundreds of people. There were local politicians in expensive suits, hospital board members, and dozens of military officers in full dress uniforms. The air buzzed with heavy anticipation. I spotted my family standing near the coat check. Sarah was wearing a sharply tailored, incredibly expensive designer dress. She was holding a glass of sparkling water, commanding the space around my aunt and uncle. They looked completely out of place, confused by the sheer volume of military brass and television cameras swirling around them. I walked up to them. I was wearing my only dark blazer. It was a cheap jacket I had bought off the rack 5 years ago. Sarah turned and looked me up and down. She let out a sharp, amused sigh. She leaned in close, ensuring the rest of the family could hear her whisper. She joked that I looked like a substitute teacher who got lost on her way to the cafeteria. She asked if my little hospital certificate was being handed out before or after the real awards, because she had a dinner reservation at 6 o'clock and really did not want to wait around for the janitorial staff recognitions. My aunt laughed nervously. My uncle stared at his shoes. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked into her eyes, checked my watch, and told her the doors were opening. The crowd filtered into the massive room. Sarah confidently marched our family down the center aisle, claiming her reserved seat in the absolute front row. She crossed her legs and smiled smugly, waiting for the boring civilian speeches to begin. I walked away and took my assigned seat near the back of the stage, hidden behind a heavy velvet curtain. The auditorium lights dimmed. The broadcast light on the main television camera blinked red. The ceremony was officially live. Sarah expected the hospital administrator to walk out holding a plastic plaque. Instead, a visiting 2-star Army general strode out to the center microphone. He bypassed the mayor, walking right past the row of smiling civilian hospital administrators. He was an imposing man. He wore his dark dress uniform, the fabric crisp, his chest completely covered in heavy, colorful rows of ribbons. He did not smile. He did not offer a folksy, polite greeting to the massive Killeen crowd. He carried a sudden, undeniable gravity that pulled all the nervous energy straight out of the room. I stood, completely still, in the shadows, behind the heavy velvet curtain, watching the video feed on a small stage monitor. Down in the absolute front row, Sarah crossed her legs and adjusted her expensive designer dress. Her smug, practiced smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. She leaned over and whispered something sharp to her husband, clearly confused. She had fully expected a hospital supervisor to waddle out to the podium, tap the microphone, and start handing out plastic participation plaques for floor nurses. She assumed the military brass was just sitting on the stage for a polite, patriotic photo opportunity at the very end of the broadcast. The general gripped the outside edges of the wooden podium. He leaned into the microphone. He announced that the city was completely bypassing the standard civilian service awards for the opening broadcast. He said that once a year, this coalition paused everything to recognize a specific kind of quiet, enduring fortitude. He looked out over the blinding glare of the television lights and stated that they were dedicating the entire opening segment to a single, previously sealed military commendation. Sarah frowned. I watched her uncross her legs. Her husband looked nervously at the heavy camera lenses panning across the crowd. The narrative in her head was beginning to fray, but she still fiercely protected her own ignorance. She clearly believed this had absolutely nothing to do with her little sister. She assumed the real military award was for some polished, high-ranking officer sitting in a private balcony, and my minor certificate would simply be handed out during the local commercial break. The general did not offer any light conversational banter. Instead, he spoke about the immense weight of combat medicine. He explained to the silent civilian crowd that a 68 whiskey is a fundamentally different breed of soldier. He said that while the infantry is trained to project overwhelming force outward, the combat medic is trained to move directly into the fire to stitch the broken pieces back together. He spoke about the terrifying isolation of trying to keep a bleeding soldier alive in the dirt, in the pitch black, miles away from any sterile surgical hospital. He told the audience that a medic operates using nothing but pressure dressings, sheer grit, and an iron refusal to let a 19-year-old kid die alone. The massive auditorium fell absolutely silent. The gravity of his words settled over the crowd like a heavy blanket. My aunt and uncle completely stopped fidgeting. My father leaned forward in his specialized transport wheelchair, his eyes locked on the stage. Even Sarah looked profoundly uneasy, slowly realizing that she was completely out of her depth in this room. The general reached beneath the wooden podium. He brought out the exact same heavy green government folder I had seen resting on the mahogany desk in the executive office weeks earlier. He placed it squarely under the small reading light and opened the heavy cover. The snap of the thick cardboard echoed sharply through the speakers. He announced that the Department of the Army, working alongside the Veterans Coalition, was officially upgrading a classified post-action report. He said they were here to honor a soldier who traded her camouflage for hospital scrubs, but who never lost her discipline. Then the general looked down at the parchment citation. He did not announce my name right away. Instead, he began to read the formal, unredacted account of a single firefight. He named the exact remote, blistering river valley in eastern Afghanistan. He spoke the exact date in 2014. And he named the specific armored cavalry regiment. On the video monitor, I saw my father physically jolt. He recognized my old unit designation immediately. The general detailed how an armored transport vehicle was struck by an explosive device and instantly pinned down by heavy, concentrated machine gun fire from an elevated ridge. He described the suffocating heat, the blinding diesel smoke, and the chaotic aftermath of 3 severely wounded soldiers trapped in the open crossfire, rapidly losing blood. Sarah's eyes widened. She stared at the general, completely paralyzed. The general turned the page of the heavy green folder. His voice dropped an octave, echoing powerfully through the silent, cavernous room. He explained how the platoon medic, facing an impossible choice between taking cover and watching her soldiers bleed out, openly defied a direct order to remain behind the armored plating. The general took a slow breath, leaned closer to the microphone, and began to describe the exact horrifying moment, that medic broke from safety and sprinted 50 yards across completely exposed ground, running directly into the enemy kill zone. The general's voice echoed through the completely silent auditorium. He did not rush the words. He described exactly how the medic reached the burning transport truck under a constant hail of machine gun fire. He detailed the sheer, terrifying medical reality of the rescue. The medic dragged the heaviest casualty out of the blinding smoke, clamped her bare, bloody hands down on a shattered femoral artery, and held that impossible pressure for 40 excruciating minutes. He explained how the medic refused to retreat. She absorbed the concussive shock of secondary explosions, holding a broken 19-year-old soldier together until the medical evacuation helicopters finally broke through the valley smoke. The general stopped speaking. He shut the heavy green cover of the folder. The sharp snap of the cardboard sounded like a gunshot. He looked directly up at the blinding glare of the television lights, and he announced my full name. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity under fire, the general stated, "The United States Army officially authorizes the Bronze Star with a Valor device to former Sergeant Elena." The name dropped into the silent room like an anvil. On the stage monitor, hidden behind the heavy velvet curtain, I watched the absolute destruction of my sister's manufactured reality. Sarah was frozen. The blood rapidly drained from her face, leaving her looking completely hollow. She was gripping the armrests of her chair so hard, her knuckles were stark white. The smug corporate director was entirely gone. In less than 2 minutes, the United States military had taken the story she had spent years building, the convenient lie that I was a cowardly, dim-witted failure, and burned it to ash on a public broadcast. My aunt let out an audible gasp. My uncle sat perfectly still. My father simply leaned forward in his specialized transport wheelchair, weeping openly, his chest heaving with overwhelming pride. A hospital administrator pulled back the edge of the velvet curtain. I took a slow breath, smoothed down my cheap blazer, and walked out into the blinding heat of the stage spotlights. The auditorium completely erupted. The applause started as a low rumble and violently built into a massive, deafening roar. Hundreds of people surged to their feet. The heavy television cameras physically swung around on their tripods to capture the moment. I stopped next to the general. I stood at attention, keeping my face completely neutral. The general gave me a sharp, deeply respectful nod. He unpinned the heavy bronze medal from the velvet display box, and he pressed it firmly into the lapel of my blazer. He shook my hand, his grip like iron. Then he turned back to the microphone and held up his hand, demanding silence from the massive crowd. The room slowly settled back into a tense, buzzing quiet. The general leaned forward. He delivered the line that anchored the entire day. He said soldiers who do the real thing rarely talk about it. They simply come home, put on blue hospital scrubs, and go quietly back to work. Then the general extended a heavily decorated arm and pointed a steady finger directly at the third row, just a few feet behind my paralyzed family. He commanded a specific young man to stand up. In the third row, a man in his late 20s slowly rose to his feet. He wore a sharp gray suit. He gripped a dark wooden cane in his right hand, leaning heavily on a shattered leg that had been painstakingly rebuilt. The general looked out at the massive crowd and finally down at my sister in the absolute front row. He stated with unwavering clarity that the soldier standing up in row 3 is alive because of her. The young man with the cane looked past the cameras. He looked directly at me. He smiled softly, raised his free hand, and snapped off a perfect, crisp military salute. I swallowed the heavy lump in my throat and returned the salute. The entire room lost its mind. The applause was a physical shockwave. Sarah was completely trapped. She was forced by the sheer social pressure of the cameras to stand up directly in front of the television audience and loudly applaud the very hero she had tried to ruin. She was entirely surrounded by the cheering family members she had so carefully manipulated. 30 minutes later, the ceremony ended. The massive crowd began to slowly filter out into the cold, clean evening toward a catered lobby reception. I immediately walked down the side stairs of the stage, attempting to quietly slip toward a secluded backstage exit. I did not want to shake hands with local politicians. I just wanted to find my old soldier in private. But as I reached the heavy glass doors of the loading dock, a sharp voice echoed off the concrete walls. I turned around. Sarah was marching down the narrow hallway. She was shaking with furious, terrified adrenaline. She had completely lost her composed corporate armor. A wounded ego always lashes out, and she was desperate to regain control. She cornered me against the concrete wall, her face flushed dark red. She jabbed a manicured finger at my chest and demanded to know why I had intentionally orchestrated this entire spectacle just to humiliate her in front of our family. The heavy auditorium doors muffled the booming sounds of the massive lobby reception. I did not raise my voice. I did not insult her expensive designer dress or point out the absolute hypocrisy of her anger. In the army, they teach you that you never meet panic with more panic. You simply neutralize the threat and secure the perimeter. I looked calmly at her flushed, frantic face. I reached into the pocket of my cheap blazer, pulled out my cell phone, and unlocked the screen. I opened the voice memo application. Without saying a single word, I pressed play and held the speaker up in the quiet corridor. The concrete hallway suddenly filled with the clear, unmistakable sound of her own voice. It was the saved audio file from my father's dusty answering machine. I know she is actually a highly competent medical professional, the recording hissed into the hallway. But if I let her step up, where does that leave me? I need her to be the failure. If I have to keep telling everyone she mixes up the pills, then that is what I will do. Sarah physically recoiled. The angry, flushed color instantly drained from her cheeks. She stared at the small digital phone screen like it was an active grenade. I stopped the playback. The silence in the hallway was far heavier than the cheering crowd had been. I looked into her panicked eyes. I told her that I was not a vindictive person. I told her I would walk out into that lobby reception right now. I would shake her hand in front of our aunt and uncle, and I would offer her a complete public forgiveness. I would let her save her dignity, and I would never play this audio clip for our father. I had absolutely no desire to destroy her carefully constructed corporate life in Austin, or drag our family into a vicious civil war. Revenge is just another form of panic, and I do not panic. But I told her the medical freeze-out was completely over. I stated my terms with absolute unbending clarity. I told her she would immediately sign over the sole medical power of attorney. I would resume full daily management of our father's health care, and I would instantly move his care back to his trusted local doctors in Killeen. I promised her that if she ever tried to block me again, or if she ever spread another single lie about my competence to our relatives, I would instantly email that audio file to every single person in our extended family. She did not argue. She did not yell. Her corporate armor was entirely shattered. She simply gave one single tight nod and followed me back into the bright lights of the lobby. The family narrative reset itself completely. Our aunt and uncle stopped treating me like a fragile disappointment. Sarah retreated to her corporate office in Austin, suddenly far too busy to micromanage our lives. She kept her distance, maintaining a stiff, polite silence. I never bragged about the Bronze Star, and I never brought up the television broadcast again. But I did not have to. I resumed my morning visits, checking my father's vitals and monitoring his fluid retention while we drank cheap coffee. The shadow work became my official daily routine again, but this time, nobody questioned my absolute authority in that room. He spent his days comfortably, entirely surrounded by steady support, and he never stopped looking at the framed bronze medal sitting on his living room mantel. I stayed in the emergency room. I kept working the brutal night shifts, and I eventually started a formal program at the hospital, specifically mentoring the younger combat medics who transition out of Fort Cavazos and struggle to find their footing in the civilian medical world. I help them translate the heavy things they carry into a quiet, enduring purpose. We exist in a world that constantly tells us we have to scream to be heard. We are told that if someone insults us, we have to completely destroy them publicly to secure our honor. But sometimes, the strongest move you can ever make is to stay quiet. Sometimes you let an arrogant person build their own trap, and you simply wait for the truth to clear the smoke. Real vindication does not require you to ruin the person who hurt you. It only requires you to hold your ground, protect the people you love, and know exactly what you are worth in the dark. Was a public forgiveness the right move, or too generous? Tell me below. Subscribe for more stories where the quiet one turns out to be the hero.